So today we are talking about afterlife in Greek philosophy, and we are moving from the concept of reincarnation to the concept of spiritual immortality. By the way, this image is a famous painting that commemorates the episode when Socrates, who is sentenced to death in Athenian prison, is about to drink the hemlock, is about to drink poison. He is surrounded by his disciples. His disciples want him to run. He had the opportunity to escape from prison, but Socrates decided not to escape for two reasons. The first reason was that he believed that dying would cure him from the illness of life. And when he dies, he will be born in the spiritual realm where he could be happier. And the second reason was that he thought that he, as an Athenian citizen, he should obey the law of his city. And that's what he does. The death of Socrates becomes so famous that it is immortalized and commemorated in many works of art. Socrates becomes the central character in all of the dialogues of Plato, who was Socrates' disciple. And the dialogue that we are going to discuss here today, the dialogue Phaedo, is also related to this episode when Socrates, who is about to die, is asked by his disciples, why is he so cheerful? Why is he not afraid of death? And in this dialogue, Socrates is explaining to his disciples, and by explaining his attitude toward death, he develops four arguments for the immortality of the soul that serve as rational justification for his cheerful attitude toward what awaits him. So let us begin. And since most of you do not have a philosophical education or training, let me start with some basic information about philosophy in general. The word philosophy means love of wisdom, literally. From the Greek language, it can be translated as love of wisdom. Sophia means wisdom. The term was probably coined by Pythagoras, somewhere around the 6th and 5th century before Christ. There are many definitions of philosophy, and philosophy is understood differently by different thinkers. But I will give you a standard definition of philosophy from the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, which is philosophy is the study of the most general and abstract features of the world and categories with which we think. Well, not to dwell upon this definition for a long time, and let us move on to the next slide. There are four traditional philosophical disciplines: epistemology, ontology, ethics, and logic. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that is asking the question, what can I know? Before we investigate the reality of things, before we investigate the general abstract aspects of the world we live in, we have to understand what are the limits of our knowledge. What can we know? And how do we know? How do we acquire knowledge? The second branch of philosophy is ontology. Ontology is that discipline that investigates the nature of reality. Is the world we live in real? If it is real, is it ultimately real? Meaning, is there something beyond this world? Or this world is the only reality we have? What is this world made of, etc. Then the third philosophical discipline is ethics. When we know the limits of our knowledge, when we form some views about the reality we find ourselves in, now we can formulate how we should live our lives. So ethics is that branch of philosophy that investigates morality and moral issues. And finally, logic is the fourth classical philosophical discipline that deals with how we think and argue correctly. Now, in American universities, you take classes in philosophy, and you may take classes in ethics. However, if you take a class in ethics, that will not make you a good person, by the way. This is a theoretical discipline. You may take class in philosophical ontology, you may take class in the introduction to philosophy that would include epistemological questions, but unfortunately in American universities you do not study logic. You do not study how to think and argue correctly. The best you can do is to take a course in critical thinking. But in American universities, critical thinking is quite different from what people in the Middle Ages studied as logic. The study of logic involves systematic study of the arguments and how they are formed and what arguments are correct and incorrect. Critical thinking is more about how to read texts and extract arguments from them. So we are not going to spend time dealing with logical questions, but in order to understand Plato, we have to talk about two things. First, we have to talk about how the arguments are formed, and we have to talk about what is definition. The central concept of classical Aristotelian logic is syllogism. Syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning from the general to the particular. That's what deductive means. The opposite of deductive reasoning is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when you start with the particular, and from the particular, you move to the general statement or to the general notion. So syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning from the general to the particular, consisting of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. So here is the classical example of the simplest syllogism. The first premise or major premise is all men are mortal. Now, obviously, you can exchange this to all humans are mortal. That does not make any difference. The minor premise is Socrates is a man, or Socrates is a human being. From those two premises follows the conclusion that Socrates is mortal, like all other men, or like all other human beings. Now, this is a correct syllogism, in which conclusion necessarily follows from the two premises. When you analyze syllogism, you have to ask yourself whether the first and the second premise are correct. If the major premise and the minor premise are 100% right, then the conclusion is also 100% right. However, if either the major premise or the minor premise are not 100% correct, they may be wrong, then the conclusion is not necessarily correct as well. For example, let us take a second look at this syllogism. So Socrates is mortal, and we know from the history that Socrates died, and therefore he is mortal. But let's exchange Socrates for any human being that is alive now. Now, this human being is a man or a woman, so the minor premise is 100% correct. But what about the major premise? All human beings are mortal. Is it 100% correct? Now, if we look at it, we may say that it's kind of obvious that it is correct. However, while at least one person is alive, we do not know whether this person will die or not. Maybe in the future, humanity will invent some means to prolong a human life indefinitely, and therefore not all human beings will be mortal. We do not know that because we do not know 100% how human organisms are functioning. We assume that aging is irreversible, and since aging is irreversible, therefore all human beings will eventually die. However, aging may be reversible. We do not know the human potentials. Therefore, the major premise, all human beings are mortal, is not 100% proven. And therefore, the conclusion of the syllogism, a certain human being who is alive is mortal, is not 100% correct. Now, let's talk about definitions. There are many ways to define things. For example, when you are asked to define something, you may give an example, an illustration of what you want to say. We are interested in a specific type of definition that is called a genus differentia definition. A genus differentia definition takes a large category, the genus, and narrows it down to a smaller category by a distinguishing characteristic, which is the differentia. Now, we are interested in this kind of definition because Socrates and Plato were interested in genus differentia definition, and this type of definition is related to Plato's theory of forms. So here are some examples of a genus differentia definition. Number one, a human being is a rational animal. So what are we defining here? A human being. What is a genus? A large category, an animal. What is the differentia? What is it that is distinguishing humans from all other animals? It is the fact that humans are rational. So therefore, in the definition, a human being is a rational animal. Animal plays the role of the genus, while rational plays the role of the differentia. The second example, a square is a plane figure that has four straight bounding sides. So here we are trying to define a square. Where is the genus? A plane figure. Where is the differentia? Having four straight bounding sides. As a result, we have a geometrical definition. A square is a plane figure that has four straight bounding sides. So please remember our discussion of the syllogism and the definition, genus differentia definition, so that now we can proceed to philosophy per se. Our main focus today is Socrates and Plato, of course. Socrates as a character in Plato's dialogues, Plato as the author of the dialogue, Phaedo, and the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers who preceded Socrates, who were called physiologoi in Greek, which means physical or natural philosophers. They were philosophers of nature who were trying to find the causes of natural events. When Socrates describes his philosophical evolution, he is saying that he started as a natural philosopher. His teachers were natural philosophers, but then he switched his interest from natural philosophy to different kind of philosophy, to the philosophy of mind. It is very difficult when you read Plato to distinguish between the views of Socrates himself and the views of Plato. We will try to do that, but remember that those two thinkers are really tied together. But still, we will start with Socrates. At the bottom right image, you see his portrait. And at the top image, you see a prison in Athens that where Socrates supposedly was held during the trial and after the trial when he was taking his poison. Now, if someday you decide to travel to Athens, please make sure that you Google philosophical map of Athens. Athens is a famous philosophical city. It is the city of the school of Athens, not only Socrates, but also Plato and Aristotle and Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, were philosophizing here. So it would be very interesting for you to actually visit some of the sites that are associated with philosophy in Athens. This is one of the sites, the Athenian city prison, where Socrates supposedly spent some of the days, maybe months, of the rest of his life. Now, this prison is located right near the Agora, the marketplace, where the Greeks would go to buy food and also to talk about philosophical and other matters. So, who was Socrates? Socrates was a simple man who was wearing the same clothes without any particular job, so unemployed, but he had a home, had a wife, Xantippe, who was known for his irony and sarcasm. So since he had no particular occupation, he was usually engaged with his fellow citizens in conversations, and in those conversations he was challenging a man who supposedly had expertise about some facet of human excellence. For example, what is piety? What is courage? What is virtue? And he would typically start a conversation with those people, challenge them through his questions and dialogue, and they would typically fail to maintain their position. Now, I have to say that Socrates wrote nothing. So this information got to us through his disciples, Plato being one of them. But we know from Plato and other writers that was his, meaning Socrates' method, engaging in dialogical search for truth while conversing with people. Now, obviously, people didn't like the fact that they would always lose to Socrates in conversations, and resentment against him grew, leading ultimately to his trial and execution on charges of impiety and corrupting youth. Socrates became the first and the only man who was tried and sentenced to death by the Athenian court, not on some kind of criminal act, but on ideological accusation on charges of impiety and especially corrupting youth. So democratic Athens sentenced its citizen to death because of seemingly ideological differences. it was never done before. And just a footnote to this information, you may think that humanity does not progress, but we do progress. It has been more than 2,000 years since the death of Socrates, and Socrates was not able to continue his descent in democratic Athens. And nowadays, in the United States, the most famous American dissenter, Noam Chomsky, who I think is 90 years old, is still doing well, is healthy, and not persecuted, very active on YouTube and in various other venues, wrote 100 or so books. One of his books became a bestseller. So as I said, he's still alive and well. Good for him and good for us. We are progressing. So let me tell you more about Socrates' philosophy and his philosophical method. As we already mentioned, there are two ways of reasoning, deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is when you start with something general, something abstract, some abstract notion, and then you apply this notion to some concrete entities or aspects or events of life. Inductive reasoning is just the opposite. You start with particular entities. You study particular entities. And then from studying particular entities, you end up by creating some general and abstract notions or definitions that are based on your studies. So here is an example. If you use a deductive reasoning, you start from questions like what is beauty? And then when you understand what beauty is in general, then you apply this idea of beauty to some particular objects. And you say that this object is beautiful because, and then you apply your definition of beauty. Inductive reasoning is just the opposite. You do not start with the general abstract notion of beauty. You start with particular things. You are trying to understand why this or that person is or is not beautiful, why this or that natural scene is beautiful or is not beautiful. And then on the basis of studying particular examples, life examples, you come up with the general and abstract notion of what the beauty is. So that was Socrates' method in philosophy, the search for the general and abstract notions, definitions, based on studying particular entities that could be related to those notions. In Plato's dialogue, Phaedo, Socrates explains his philosophical evolution that took place at some point when he, being a natural philosopher, shifted his focus from the study of nature to the world of mind. When Socrates was young, he was greatly interested in natural philosophy. He was eager to discover the causes of things. Now, the term cause, which is one of the central vocabulary terms for us in this lecture, is aitia in Greek, translated here as cause. By causes, Socrates means physical or natural causes. So, for example, the wind is blowing and the grass obeys the wind. Why is the grass, changing its position, obeying the wind? Because of the wind. This is a natural cause of some event that is happening in nature. That's what Socrates means by natural causes. But then, eventually, Socrates comes to the realization that to look for natural causes means not to distinguish the cause from the condition. Now, you see here reference to 99b. This is a reference to a specific place in the dialogue Phaedo. So he comes to the realization that natural causes are not the true causes of the happenings of things. This is not the true cause of why things happen. This is simply the condition under which the change is happening or some event is happening, but the real cause is different. Socrates finds a new interpretation of causes, which he now understands as notions, abstract notions. He turns to the world of mind, I quote again from the dialogue, he turns to the world of mind and seeks there the truth of existence. Now let us see what he really means by that. According to this newfound philosophical position, the real cause of a thing is something which exists as itself and which this thing is partaking of. For example, we may say that this person or that person is tall or short. And when we compare to, let's say, human beings, we may say that one is taller and another one is shorter. So the forms of tallness and shortness are used relatively to something else. But if we take them absolutely and independently of things or objects which participate in them, in other words, if we take the idea of being short and the idea of being tall independently of anyone to whom we apply those terms, then we will see that these are two different notions that exclude each other. The idea of tallness excludes the idea of shortness. The idea of oddness excludes the idea of evenness. The idea of cold it excludes the idea of heat, etc. So here we come to the so-called Socratic method of searching for definitions. A search for definition means, if we use contemporary philosophical terminology, a search for the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of terms. Now, before we search for any kind of truth, we have to make sure that we apply the terms we are using, namely in this case, being short and being tall. We have to make sure that we apply those terms correctly. So here is how it looks like if we use contemporary terminology. Under the condition that being tall or short and tallness or shortness are opposite, being short is that by which something partakes of shortness if and only if nothing is such that by being tall it partakes of shortness, which is a necessary condition of the use of the term. Nothing is such that being short it partakes of tallness, which is the sufficient condition of the use of the term. And finally, being short is not itself tallness. So I said that it is rather difficult to distinguish between Socrates' philosophy and Plato's philosophy, because Socrates wrote nothing and we know him only as the main character of Plato's dialogues. However, scholars believe that this was the method of Socratic philosophy. In other words, that he was interested in the logical application of terms. And the idea that those terms may have not only logical, but real existence, ontological existence. This idea, according to some scholars, already belongs to Plato himself. And that is why we are moving on to the author of the dialogue. And first, let me say, as always, something about the guy first. Plato, this is his portrait. You could see it on the right bottom slide. Plato was one of the disciples of Socrates, and of course, Plato immortalized his teacher as the main character in all of his dialogues. Plato is not only a famous philosopher, but he is also famous for opening the school of higher education in Athens. That happened around 387 before Christ in the sacred grove of Academos in the Attic countryside near Athens. Now, if you are in Athens, you should take a bus that would drive you to this place, or at least to what remains of this place. It is at the outskirts of Athens. The bus stop is called Plato's Academy. Very touching. And what you see, however, in the place is what you see in the right upper slide. Nothing. There are no olive trees. There are no buildings. There is one building that was excavated, but it is left without any work, probably because the mayor of Athens does not have enough money to support the project, and Athens, not only Athens, but Greece as a country is not in good shape financially. So they probably don't have money to do some excavations and reconstructions. So the only thing that you have is a park with those strange things that remain of this academy. And when I was there, one teacher from the university was reading Plato with his students in Greek. That was a very touching scene indeed. Now, back in Plato's times, it was different. Plato was a very wealthy guy. And he created the School of Higher Education not as a university, but as a private club. People did not pay anything, no membership fee. They were simply gathering and talking about various things, philosophy, politics, etc. The grove of olive trees was also very symbolic because it was dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, war, and crafts. In the case of Plato, wisdom was more appropriate than war. Later, the garden was named for Academos or Hecademos, a local hero after which the academy was named. So this academy stands as the prototype of Western universities. It started as a private club, but then it grew into a school of higher education, more formal. Plato spent the rest of his life teaching there and writing there. One of the great philosophers of all times, Aristotle, studied in the academy and then taught in the academy. Overall, he spent 20 years as a student and as a teacher in the academy. Now, what did happen with this school? In the Hellenistic times, the academy did survive, but it became a skeptical school. The main representatives were skeptics, which means that they rejected the absolute truth. They were trying to follow the Socratic method of asking questions but not giving any answers. Then the school was destroyed by the Romans in 83 BC, but about 4 centuries later, around 410 after Christ, the academy was revived as a mystical school of Neoplatonic philosophy. Still, it did not survive for a long time. The Emperor Justinian closed the academy for good because of its pagan philosophy, pagan orientation, and that date, 529, is often cited as the end of antiquity. Now let us look at Plato's theory of forms. And let me start by saying that the theory of forms has three aspects or three applications. First, logical application, then ontological application, and finally, an epistemological application. So as for its logical application, we already know that Socrates was engaged in searching for truth through his inductive and definitory method, trying to find truth through definitions. So this is the logical application of the forms. But later in the dialogue, Plato introduces forms in a different context, in an ontological context. Remember that ontology is that branch of philosophical knowledge that investigates the question, what is real? What does really exist? So in his theory of forms, Plato is trying to resolve the philosophical problem of universals. The problem of universals is formulated as follows. How can a class of objects, or one thing in general, be many things in particular? Let me give you two examples. How can a class of objects, for example, all of us are human beings. So when you look at me, you look at a specific person, a unique individuality. But at the same time, you classify me as a human being. Is this classification somehow part of me? Does it exist in me somewhere? Or is this classifying term exists in your mind and is simply the way to classify things? The first response, that this class of objects exists in the objects, is one position, one resolution of the theory of universals. The second position, for example, is that the classification of objects is simply a conceptual thing that exists in the mind of those people who do the classification, is another possible solution to the problem of universals. Here is another example. Remember that Plato lived more than 2,000 years ago. He did not study modern science. He did not know physics, chemistry, etc. So to us, this question may sound silly, but philosophically speaking, this question was quite serious. We know from our experience that many things could be read. How is it possible that redness, which is in this case a universal quality, is distributed throughout many things? Does this mean that redness is part of those many things being at the same time one and the same? So this question, again, to us who know optics, may sound silly, but the problem of universals is one of the philosophical problems that goes throughout the whole history of Western philosophy. Now, what Plato was interested in when looking at the problem of universals is the so-called special predication. Now, there are two kinds of predication, general and special. The example of a general predication is Socrates is just. Now, if you look at this sentence, you will see that Socrates is defined through one of his qualities, just. So the quality itself is part of the term that is being defined. Special predication reverses that. The example of a special predication is Socrates is human. Here, Socrates is also defined, but he is defined not through something that is smaller in scale than he himself, but through something that is higher in the hierarchy of classifications than Socrates. Human is the larger category, the genus, while Socrates is one step down. So Plato was interested in special predication in those general categories, those abstract notions. He called them forms. The key terms here are the form. In Greek, it is eidos. And as we said already, idea, which is translated as cause, as the reason for something, explanation of something, or by which. Platonic theory of forms is explored in the dialogue in 3 dimensions. And we are moving away from logical dimension. We are now trying to explore the ontological and epistemological dimension. And in order to explore the ontological dimension of the idea of a form or a universal, we have to mention his other dialogue, Timaeus, in which Plato distinguishes between the physical world of becoming and change and the eternal realm of being that never changes. You may remember the so-called allegory of the cave. This allegory of the cave comes from one of Plato's works, The Republic. And it distinguishes between those two worlds, the world of being and the world of becoming. It compares our physical world of becoming to the cave, in which we are blinded because there is no light. The only thing that we see are simply the reflections of the light from the real world, which is outside the cave. So according to Plato, the physical realm, the material universe, is simply the world of becoming and change. And by trying to understand it, we will not be able to understand the real truth, because the real truth comes to us from the realm of being, in religious terms, from the spiritual realm or from the spiritual world that does not experience any change. Now, according to Plato, the demiurge, or God, made this physical universe by using the eternal and perfect realm of forms, or ideals, as a template. So our world is the world of reflection. If you remember our discussion of Buddhism, our world is the world of offspring, but the mother world is the realm of forms. Sense perception produces only changing beliefs that correspond to our world of becoming, while reason delivers the knowledge of forms, which represents the changeless truth. And here we come to the third and last epistemological dimension of Plato's theory of forms. What is the source of our knowledge, and what is the limit of our knowledge? According to Plato, sense perception does not really deliver any solid knowledge to us, because sense perception gives us knowledge of the world of becoming. And since everything is changing in this world, there is nothing stable and there is no stable knowledge. In order to achieve knowledge of truth that is stable and changeless, we have to use our reason, and our reason is able to penetrate the realm of forms, intuit those forms. And this is the only way for us to acquire a true and solid knowledge of how things are. So here we may come back to Socrates, who was explaining to his disciples why he's so cheerful before his death. Because Socrates believes that when he dies, instead of seeing the reflections of forms, he would actually contemplate the realm of forms and the real forms. And his life as a philosopher would improve as a result. As I said before, in his dialogue, Phaedo, Socrates, who is about to die by drinking poison, is trying to console his disciples by developing 4 arguments for the immortality of the soul. He wants to tell them that they should not be afraid of death, because death is not actually the end of life, but it is the liberation from the prison of the cave in which we do not have the real life. Death is actually a birth into a world of spirit and forms. Those 4 arguments have their names in the history of philosophy, and I organize those arguments in the form of a syllogism. It is much better to organize arguments in the form of a syllogism, because then you could apply a standard strategy by analyzing logically the syllogism in order to see whether the conclusion is correct. You have to make sure that the premise, the major premise, is correct and the minor premise is correct. If both premises are correct, then you can conclude that the conclusion is actually correct. So when you read the dialogue, I would advise you to find the arguments and put it in a logical form, and only after that to analyze the actual arguments and to come up with your own conclusions, whether Socrates was right or wrong. In this lecture, I will simply follow the arguments one by one. So the first is the so-called cyclical argument. The major premise says that the world is based on the notion of becoming or constant transformation of the opposites. Birth is followed by death, summer is followed by winter, morning is followed by night, etc. The minor premise says that life is the opposite of death, or birth/life is the opposite of death. As a result, Socrates comes to a conclusion that death cannot be a total annihilation, but a transformation into something else, into the opposite, which is life. The second argument is called the theory of recollection argument. Plato, like many other ancient thinkers, believed in reincarnation. And this is part of his epistemological views, and the major premise of the argument reveals this belief. The major premise of the argument is as follows. Knowledge represents a recollection of ideas which we already knew before birth. The minor premise is that our soul existed before birth. And since our soul existed before birth, it is plausible that it may exist after death as well. The third argument is called the Affinity Argument. The major premise here does not come from any theory, but comes from our observation, our everyday experience. Our body is constantly changing. This is the major premise. The minor premise is that this presupposes something that undergoes that change. Otherwise, what is changing? Conclusion, therefore, our soul, which undergoes the change, is not bodily or material. And since it is not bodily or material, it has to be eternal and immortal. And finally, the fourth and the most complicated argument that Socrates is giving to his disciples at the end of the dialogue involves the theory of forms. In Plato, you will find some arguments that are not directly connected with his philosophical ideas. They are simply based on observation of life. And there are arguments that depend on his personal philosophy. So if you accept this philosophy, if you accept Plato's theory of forms, this argument has better chances for you to sound correct. But if you reject the theory of forms at the outset, then the argument has fewer chances of sounding right. So this is one of such arguments, the argument from form of life. The first premise says that all entities acquire existence by partaking of abstract forms that are eternal. This is Plato's theory of forms. And again, if you reject this premise, if you reject Plato's philosophy, the whole argument collapses. But if you accept it, then you may proceed further. In the material world, things do not tolerate the presence in them of opposite forms. So, for example, when you partake of, let's say, the form of coldness, when you are cold, you cannot partake at the same time of the form of heat. You cannot be hot and cold at the same time. You cannot be tall and short at the same time. The numbers cannot be odd and even at the same time. So things in the material world do not tolerate the presence in them of opposite forms. But human soul is the form of life of a body. Human soul is what gives life to the body. The body is alive because it partakes of the form of life. Therefore, Socrates and Plato come to a conclusion. When the body dies, as any abstract form, the soul continues its existence on a different plane. And that concludes my lecture about Socrates and Plato and Plato's dialogue. Phaedo, thank you for watching. See you next time.